Grief is really, I guess, our response to loss. So it's a normal, natural human response to loss in some way. So it's often characterized by a range of different feelings. So it could be sadness, anger, could be despair, there could be a sense of sort of shame, frustration. So a whole range of different emotions. Often people have this expectation that grief is going to go away. That's probably one of the real big ones. So I think sometimes people think, and this is one of the things, as I mentioned before as well, around societal stuff. It's like, okay, you've had your week now, you've sort of laid at home and you've cried and you've looked at photos, it's time to get on with things. But we know that that's certainly not the case for people, and people's grief doesn't necessarily get smaller. We often think that all people respond the same to loss and grief, and certainly that's not the case as well. There's often a lot of sort of expectations or rules around how someone should grieve and what they should do and what a funeral should look like and how a person should act and behave after losing someone. But we all know it is a very individual process, and if someone already has existing individual differences, then obviously as well they're going to respond to the grief in a different way.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of This Complex Life. In today's episode, I chat with Liam Spicer and we talk about something that's probably not the most heartwarming or fun topic, but it's something we're all inevitably not about to experience, but will experience in life. And that is talking about grief and bereavement. Welcome, Liam.
Thanks for having me on the show. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Could you let the audience know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So my name's Liam Spicer. I live down here in Tasmania. I'm a psychologist and I'm also doing a PhD right now in the area of grief. Do a lot in the sort of EMDR space and also neurodivergent space in terms of sort of client work. So I do work with clients throughout the week and also supervise other people. Grief has just been a particular area that I've ended up focusing on over the last couple of years, which has led me into obviously research, but obviously practice and different presentations as well. And yeah, it's interesting how you sort of naturally go into particular areas and find yourself in those areas in life. And so, yeah, I'm really glad to actually be working in this space and being able to educate and teach people in this space because it is quite important.
Yeah. How did grief find you? Like an interesting topic to focus on for your PhD and your career.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. It is one of those sort of stories around personal experiences and how that often relates to someone's sort of professional journey. So throughout my honours year in psychology, unfortunately, I'd lost two friends throughout that year. One was a very close friend and another friend not long after as well. And I think through those experiences of grief, it often made me a little bit more aware just how impactful grief can be, but just in a lot of the different ways that often grief may not get talked about within society as well. A few years down the track after that as well, myself and my wife on the journey to starting a family together, unfortunately suffered a lot of pregnancy losses, and the grief around that was quite a unique experience and something that often isn't talked about as well in terms of sort of suffering in silence and I guess some stigma and stuff around sort of pregnancy loss and lack of support and availability throughout that time. So certainly those personal experiences really led me into having a deep interest in grief, understanding grief, and really trying to support people more in this particular area. So that sort of led to a natural passion and enthusiasm for this area from those experiences. And then over time, working with a lot of clients in the grief space in different capacities and then doing research in different forms, that's sort of continued my sort of road and journey in this area.
I was going to ask about what grief is, but for a moment, I just want to pull out something else, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
As therapists, and previously the school of thought was we have to have all the answers and we can't relate to the people that we work with and we've got to be the professional. But something like grief affects all of us. How have you integrated those sorts of experiences of your own into the work you do? Because even choosing to mention it on a podcast, for example, is really connecting with the audience in a different way rather than coming at it purely academically and saying, here are the stages of grief, or this is what we do. And it's really actually, it adds a level of authenticity and humility and vulnerability to the work.
Yeah, I certainly see that as one of the most important components when supporting someone with grief. As you mentioned, it is a common and universal experience, and we all do go through grief. And I think, in terms of supporting someone throughout that process, having someone who understands what grief can feel like and the challenges that it may bring up, or the different pain and emotion that we may experience, I think that can really create a deep connection with a client and can really allow them to sort of have a sense of normalization and validation around their experiences. And I think it's sometimes one of those things that, often because grief is so common and is experienced by everyone, I think at times, often it can get overlooked. And sometimes within society in particular, there can be a bit of a sense of, okay, you've lost someone, you've had a week off work, back to it. And I certainly don't think those sort of approaches or perspectives towards things are quite helpful. I think we often know someone that's broken a bone throughout our life. And just because that's common, does that not mean that throughout that period of time for that person, it was not difficult? So I think we really need to try and think about, well, how is this person experiencing the loss, and how are they going through it? And I certainly think being human, being authentic, and being genuine as professionals, but also just as humans in everyday life when sort of supporting or interacting with someone going through grief, I think it's really of paramount importance.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of phrasing it, and but we don't always respond in the way that maybe that person needs.
Hmm.
How do you, I guess, define grief? And maybe how is it different or similar to bereavement? Because I hear them used interchangeably, and then also grief in terms of situations or hopes and dreams that have been lost, or it's not always around a death. Can you unpack those
Yes.
two kind of terms, or nut them out a bit?
Yeah, so grief is really, I guess, our response to loss. So it's a normal, natural human response to loss in some way. So it's often characterized by a range of different feelings. So it could be sadness, anger, could be despair. There could be a sense of sort of shame, frustration. So a whole range of different emotions, and also typical behaviors as well that are seen in someone going through the sort of grief process. As you did mention, sort of grief isn't something that just happens in relation to the loss of a special person in our life. So, in fact, the experience of grief can come in many different forms. Grief can come around maybe perhaps the loss of a job. Grief can come around lost opportunities. Grief can come in terms of pet loss. It can even come after sort of different changes in our life, and then reflecting on what things could have been like. And there can really be a sense of grief. That's often something seen for people maybe getting a diagnosis of something later in life, or perhaps around sort of physical health complications, or things like that as well. People can often experience grief. So, yeah, grief is important to look at it in that way, and sort of look at it more as a broader understanding of loss than just death loss. So that's one important thing. And with bereavements, often that's referring to, I guess, the person's sort of experience of that loss and the process and journey of that as well. So they are often sort of used interchangeably, and often people can think about both of them in quite similar ways. But yeah, it is important to really think about grief beyond just human death loss, in terms of looking at loss and death and bereavement.
You give me an example of like grief, like in a non-death loss.
Yeah, so grief in non-death loss, for example, it could be around maybe loss of functioning, loss of mobility. So, for example, if someone's diagnosed with maybe a neurodegenerative disorder, or there could be perhaps other physical challenges or changes that happen to that person at some points in life, there can be a sense of grief around, I can't actually walk to the shop anymore. There's a sense of loss because something's been taken away. Something that the person's been used to has then been taken away. And there's often sort of profound changes associated with that. There's obviously the change to the activity, but there's the change in terms of the meaning that the person relates to that activity, how they see themselves, how they now see the world. So it can be quite profound at lots of different levels. Another example of sort of non-death loss can often be for people, for example, maybe getting diagnosed and identified as being autistic or ADHD in adulthood or later on in life. There can often be a profound sense of grief for people around what life could have looked like if I had have been recognized earlier, and thinking about the sadness around what they did miss out on and the sense of loss in different ways. So there is some examples there of sort of non-death loss, but I think it is important to, I guess, take those into consideration as well, because when often people go through grief, there can be lots of different emotions, there can be a lot of different sort of changes in behavior. And if we're not understanding that this person's going through a grieving process in relation to this other life change or non-death loss, then they may not get the support that they might need in that situation, or sort of be looking out for themselves as well.
Yeah, I like that example you gave of loss of function or even a recent maybe discovery or diagnosis. And it's that feeling of what could have been or what
Mm,
things might have been like. And
mm,
I was having a session earlier this week with someone who lost a family member, and they weren't particularly close to that family member. So they were very confused by these feelings. But I think when we unpacked it, it was a grief from like a death loss, but it wasn't so much the relationship, it's what the relationship could have been.
could have been.
And yeah, and that person no longer being around meant that nothing can be.
Mm,
And so while they were alive, there was this possibility of reconnection or rekindling that relationship or some hope or dream or desire in that. But then them not being around anymore, they're grieving what might have been. And they
mm,
found that really confusing because they're like, well, we weren't particularly close. We didn't see each other very often. I don't know if I really want to celebrate their life, but I'm still
mm.
feeling all these feelings. And it was this complex fusion of the two.
For sure. Yeah, and you can certainly see that for a lot of people in non-death loss, but also death loss, as you mentioned, where a lot of the time it's not just around, well, this person isn't here anymore. It can also be the fact that my whole imagined future and my known reality of how I live my life and how I function day to day, and when I go home, I have this routine of saying this and doing this, and we go to this special place on these particular days. All of that fundamentally changes. So it can be such a profound shift in that whole person's reality when they lose someone, especially someone very close to them, because all of these things that were second nature, all of these sort of habitual patterns and ways of going about the day can then fundamentally change for the person. And I like that you mentioned there as well around this person's grief response in the absence of them feeling perhaps that it was the strongest connection. That's really important to understand as well, because I guess one of the big myths around grief sometimes is that our level of grief or our experience of grief is dependent on how close we know someone or how close we are to that particular person. But we certainly know that that's not true. And obviously, there can be so many different factors around the experience of grief that can obviously make it sort of more distressing and more challenging for people and harder to accommodate it into their life. It's not just dependent on what that relationship was.
What do we get wrong about grief? What do we misunderstand about it?
Yeah, I think a couple big things is that often people have this expectation that grief is going to go away. That's probably one of the real big ones. So I think sometimes people think, and this is one of the things, as I mentioned before as well, around societal stuff. It's like, okay, you've had your week now, you've sort of laid at home and you've cried and you've looked at photos, it's time to get on with things. But we know that that's certainly not the case for people, and people's grief doesn't necessarily get smaller. There's a lot of sort of discussion out there within the field of grief. And one of the really agreed upon areas is really looking at grief in terms of it not necessarily getting smaller, but our life grows around the grief. So often we accommodate the loss into our life. However, those feelings are still going to be there in certain ways, and at different times, sort of waves of grief will come. For example, anniversaries or birthdays or Christmas. And it's important not to pathologize those responses, but that's certainly one big one out there that's a little bit of a myth. I think also as well, we often think that all people respond the same to loss and grief. And certainly that's not the case as well. There's often a lot of sort of expectations or rules around how someone should grieve and what they should do and what a funeral should look like and how a person should act and behave after losing someone. But we all know it is a very individual process. And if someone already has existing individual differences, then obviously as well, they're going to respond to the grief in a different way as well. So I think that's another big thing that's a bit of a myth, or I guess what we're sort of doing wrong in the area of grief is expecting or thinking that people are going to respond the same. Regarding, I guess, some of the ways that people view grief, one of the big sort of frameworks or models out there in the past has often been like the sort of 5 stages of grief. And that's certainly been around for quite some time now. A lot of people perhaps see that in sort of movies and TV shows and whatnot. And it sort of suggests that we sort of progress and go through these different phases to get to a level of acceptance. We do know as well now that from empirical research and just from understanding more about what grief is actually like for people, that that in fact isn't the case, and that although some people may experience all those 5 phases of grief, that it's not going to be experienced for all people, and certainly it may not be experienced in the sort of suggested order as well. So certainly that's another sort of big factor about grief as well that I think we need to take into consideration.
I mean, from memory, dusting off the psych study, that model was based on a person's own, like in palliative care or a diagnosis of a terminal illness. So the stages of grief was actually based on how that person grieves their own death rather than for someone
Someone
else.
else's. Yeah. And that's one of the things as well. Like as our understanding of grief has evolved over time, like we need to be looking at things in terms of it being a little bit more, I guess, complex and nuanced and a little bit more multifaceted in the sense that there's so many individual predictors, social predictors, cultural, religious, spiritual factors that all really impact on someone's experience of grief. So I think looking at things from one model or one perspective or one framework, and there's a right and a wrong, that's sort of trying to simplify it a little bit too much. And we do need to take into consideration someone's unique social, interpersonal, family life. We need to take into consideration their past backgrounds, their current mental health. There's so many different factors that obviously impact on someone's experience of grief. So, yeah, certainly it's good to sort of think broad and think outside the box in relation to our experience of grief.
How would you kind of work with someone who they feel guilty to be happy when someone close to them has passed away? So if it's the loss of a parent or a child or a sibling, I've worked with folk who, when they experience a moment of happiness, they immediately pull away because they feel not necessarily survivor's guilt. That might be a whole different thing, but if I'm
Mm,
happy, it means I don't miss them anymore. Or if I let go of those really raw feelings of grief, or forget them. So they really get stuck in this place of not wanting to be disrespectful, or,
mm,
being happy feels inappropriate. So
mm.
there's the grief at the loss, but then there's these other complex thoughts and feelings that sort of emerge in those discussions. Do you have that, or have you observed that in some people that you work with?
Yeah, certainly. I think it can be quite common for some people. And I think one of the big things, firstly, is to really try and, I guess, create a deep connection with that person and obviously normalize the feelings that are going on and provide a sort of sense of validation around those things. I think a lot of time, especially around sort of memories of the deceased, I've certainly seen in particular that people sort of have fear letting go even of distressing or traumatic memories associated with the loss because they feel like they're going to lose the connection with that person in some sense. But often what we know is the sort of opposite's true, whereas we actually work through some of the big emotions and perhaps some of the distress, they often can recount sort of more positive memories. But I think sometimes there can be sort of interventions and things that can be useful for people, especially experiencing these feelings of grief. Often I've found trying to create some form of connection with that lost person is a good way to actually allow them to maybe even express some of these feelings. And you can actually even have a bit of a dialogue as well. So some of the common approaches within sort of general grief work is often the use of chair work, where often the person can perhaps be expressing maybe that they're feeling a sense of guilt and they're feeling bad that they're moving on or trying to do things to re-engage in life. And then they can actually have the imagined deceased person in a chair speak back to them and say some information or perhaps some words that's going to create a little bit of a shift in them. So I think a lot of the time people would understand that that loved one wouldn't want us to be feeling like we can't do anything anymore or feeling like we can't be happy and enjoy life. So that can certainly be a bit of a useful intervention. And gradually over time, sort of increasing levels of behavioural engagement is certainly something that's been shown to be positively supported throughout the research that can help even with the feelings of guilt. As the more they're engaging in new things, creating joy and creating new experiences, they can often start to have a bit of a reduction in those feelings as well. So things like that can often be quite useful, and letter writing and stuff like that can also sort of serve that purpose when people are feeling those sort of guilty feelings as well.
So that's quite good for those therapists who are listening. You know, you might be able to use some of your schema therapy training, but what can a friend or family member do? So if they're listening to this and starting to think, wow, it's more complex and the 3-day compassionate leave we get is not enough. How can people start to use this new discourse, or as they start to understand this a bit more, how can they show up for that person? Like, what are some ways that people can have different conversations? Because in my experience, we don't do grief well at all. And people are very uncomfortable and they're worried to maybe upset the person or bring up those memories. But they don't know that that person's probably thinking about it anyway. And they're coming back to work or to school, or maybe it's the anniversary of the death of a loved one, and no one asks about it. And they feel incredibly alone. And then that loneliness exacerbates a lot of the distress. So how can we encourage people to do something different?
Yeah, and that's a really good point to make. I think a lot of people often sort of feel like they're walking on eggshells or feel like it's best to sort of not say anything in fear of actually making things worse for that person. But I certainly do feel like we have to not be afraid to have these conversations, not be afraid to actually ask someone genuinely, how are you going? And I think in terms of finding what that person actually actively needs in a particular situation, we can simply ask the question, what do you need? What do you feel like you need? Do you want to talk about the loss, or do you maybe just want to go out and catch up and have a bit of a coffee? Or do you want to maybe go and do something that's actually going to help you have a fun or new experience? Because I know that you haven't been out of the house for a month now. So we really need to just think about it, tailoring it to that person. And as a friend or a family member or another supporting that person's life, just even directly asking them the question, what do you feel like you need? What would actually help you the most right now with what you're going on? And it obviously sounds quite simple, but even within the field of grief, often we think about social support needs to be someone that is going to be our counselor or talking to us about the grief and sort of sitting with us all the time with those emotions. But sometimes as well, even just having a figure that might help us out with household tasks or responsibilities or other stresses going on in our life, or having someone that just connects with us and we can go out and create new pleasurable experiences that can really be meaningful and important as well. And in the area of grief, we often talk about things in terms of a dual process model, where in order to accommodate and adjust to a loss, it's often a bit of a balance between connecting with the grief, but also reinventing and creating a new life beyond the loss that still has purpose and meaning. So, in terms of support, we don't always have to be sitting there with the person and talking about the grief or having to sort of be with those big emotions. We could be doing some of the other stuff as well that helps the person sort of reinvest in their life now.
Yeah, I love that. One thing I often suggest people do is probably a little more specific than asking, what do you need? Because if someone's really in the midst of quite big feelings, they often can't think clearly. and they
Mm,
don't want to impose. So I encourage people, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, to be specific of what their boundaries or their capacity to offer is. So if it is saying, I can bring you a lasagna once a week for the next few weeks, I can walk your dog, I can take your kids to school, or I can pick you up, we can go for a drive and we can sit in absolute silence. Because everyone will say, "Oh, just call me if you need something." And on the person
mm,
on anyone who's ever been on the other side of that notes the well wishes, but never actually takes people up on that offer
for
because
sure.
they don't want
Yeah.
to be too much. They don't want to impose. They
Mm,
think that it's only out of obligation. And we make up all these stories and we don't reach out because we don't even know what the limits are of that
mm.
person's support. So, how can we narrow down the focus a bit?
Definitely. And I think that's a really great suggestion, as you mentioned there. Like, often when we might ask a question, it might be difficult to elicit responses, giving examples, giving suggestions, and saying, well, I can do this. I can sit with you and hear about the grief. I can actually help you out at a practical level. I can actually engage in this way with you, and we can actually go out and do these activities. I think often just the human connection and interpersonal relationship when we're going through the experience of grief, especially in those early days, can often be such a vital thing. And what we know as well, even through sort of looking at things from, I guess, our nervous system perspective, is that just having that co-regulation, connecting with someone else, that could be quite powerful and empowering for the person and can really assist them in terms of trying to make sense of everything. So, yeah, I think that's a really great sort of example there of giving specific suggestions and actually figuring out, well, what can I do? What's my capacity as someone supporting the grief? And then the person grieving can obviously take up on those different offers on what they actually need the most.
Yeah. And what about self-help? Like I often recommend to people if they have the capacity to read the book, It's Okay Not to Be Okay, and use some of those resources or even listen to some interviews with the author. Do you have any kind of self-help tips for folk who are listening?
Yeah, I certainly think one of the most important sort of resources or areas out there is actually through the Australian Centre for Grief and Bereavement. That's got a really good range and collection of different resources regarding grief. So there's different fact sheets on what is grief, how do we respond to grief, how do we actually keep a connection with someone past the loss. They've also got very specific tailored ones to particular areas as well. So there's one on there, for example, on how do we support someone who's grieving. There's one on there for pet loss. There's one on there for children in grief. There's also one about sort of managing anniversaries and other significant events. So there's a whole range of different resources and different handouts on that particular website. So often provide some of those to clients and also direct other people to those resources, because I think one of the big things in grief and getting support around grief is actually having some education around, well, what it is, what it's going to look like, how can I try and make sense and adjust and accommodate the loss into my life? And that can be quite an important thing. And they do even have an app on there as well, which is like a My Grief Buddy app, I think it's called. And that can be useful for people where they can actually sort of use an app that has different resources and they can sort of do activities as well that can be quite helpful for people sort of during that more acute phase of grief.
And as a kind of wrapping up, what are some general kind of takeaways? Like if we simplify it right down to people who this might be all new, they've never listened to anything about grief, and yet every single person they know will have experienced this or might, or they have themselves. How do we kind of give them some parting words of wisdom
Hmm.
or advice on that?
Hmm. I think grief is very powerful in the sense that is also what connects us all as humans. So I think it is really nice to look at grief in the sense that obviously as humans, it is something that is a universal experience. It does unite us. And I think having that understanding can bring in the real humanness and sense of connection when we're supporting someone with grief. So I think really trying to break things down and understand that from that person's perspective, life looks like now, understand the unique challenges, and try and support them in the best way we possibly can. I think it is nice to sort of look at things in that way and look at it that this is a universal experience, and how collectively, whether it's friends, family, or other people in that person's life, can allow them to try and accommodate and adjust it into their life as much as possible. I think that would certainly be something to sort of think about and reflect about, and just normalize that it is unique, it is individual, and we all do experience it in different ways. I think they're some of the really key things to take away.
Yeah, and I think the feelings you mentioned at the start around what can come with grief. So can be anger, hurt, frustration, pain. Like there's all these things bundled in with
Mm,
grief
that's
that
right.
that
Yeah,
can be activated in us.
that's right. It's not just one thing. And I think in terms of how it impacts on our behaviors as well, it's such a wide and far reaching thing. We might feel less social for a period of time. We might sort of feel a bit avoidance of certain topics or going to certain places for a point of time as well. And we might find it really challenging to do things that we used to find pleasurable for a period of time as well. So I think it is good to look at it in the sense that it's universal. It's experienced by all of us, which obviously unites us all in some way as well when supporting someone. But obviously, it is something that does impact us on different ways. And that's why it's good to have support that's going to support us in a way that's going to meet our needs the most.
That's beautiful. And when is it maybe a time to get some professional support?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's one of those things that we do know through research that sort of direct intervention for someone just experiencing acute grief after loss isn't necessarily sort of warranted or needed per se. I think a lot of the time, as I mentioned, although the pain and the sadness there is there still, a lot of people accommodate and adjust the loss into their life. So certainly people can obviously have a bit of a chat, go through some grief counseling, get some resources, get some education and support if they feel that would be beneficial. I think it's really up to the person in that regard. But in terms of sort of specific therapy and sort of intervention, often that's sort of really needed when someone experiences, I guess, a more complicated or prolonged grief response. It's difficult to sort of put exact time frames on things. There's a lot of individual factors around that, but based on, I guess, the research and criteria out there, it's often if people sort of at least 12 months post the loss are still experiencing grief in a very debilitating and intense way. So that's sort of what they're experiencing it like in those early phases sort of feels like it's still like that, even 12 months post the loss. And there's a whole range of criteria and whatnot for that. But that often does require some more sort of specific intervention and support. And about sort of 7 to 10% of the bereaved population experience that more form of complicated and prolonged grief. So we do know that different factors make it more likely that people develop that response. But yeah, it's just good to keep an eye on things, keep an eye on people in our lives when they have lost someone, checking in with them, how they feel like they're going in response to the grief. I guess being aware for ourselves as well around, I guess, are there factors that even maybe 12 or 6 months afterwards are really still impacting on us where we may need the support. So yeah, I think it is just important to be aware that obviously we all do experience of grief, but for some people, there is a more sort of complicated and prolonged form of grief that does occur and often does need sort of more formal intervention.
Okay, that's really helpful for people to know. And can people kind of seek professional support anyway? Like I know when I had a death in the family, I went and saw a counselor because there was time to be able to share those experiences with other family members, but then there was also a time where I didn't want to hold space for someone else or have this
Mm,
idea of I don't want to then upset you or if you're having a good like so it was like I wanted a place that was just for me with someone who could let me feel my feelings vent without me worrying that it's going to upset them or impact them. So is it also okay to just have a few sessions with someone, with a counselor, with a therapist, psychologist to just process or unpack?
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a really good idea. And as I mentioned, it's really based on what the person feels is going to support them the most throughout that process. So a lot of the time people may go through a loss. They may sort of do some sort of general counseling. They may get some support from some form of professional in some way. But that being said as well, like it can also come in the form of sort of religious support or spiritual support. Often that can be a common thing where people may talk about their experience of grief in those sort of settings as well, and that can certainly be very helpful for people. So, yeah, it is important to know that sometimes people may just need a little bit of space, a little bit of time to tell their story, be able to be there and connect with someone external to their family and friends. And that's a really great thing. And also for people that then, I guess, do have that more prolonged or complicated response, they can also get intervention and support around that down the track if they really need to as well.
Awesome. Well, I'll pop in the links to that book that I mentioned and the grief and bereavement website. Do you have any other resources that either people can look at for themselves or for someone they're concerned about, anywhere they should check out or go or come to Tassie and see you?
Yeah, there's an interesting book actually that was written from someone and just I think released in the last year, which is written for a general audience. It's really quite interesting in terms of it sort of talking about personal experiences of grief and also sort of all the up-to-date research in the area, but in a very simple and easy to understand way. And that book is called The Grieving Brain. It's quite a fascinating book that sort of talks about, well, how do we understand grief from, I guess, our brain's perspective? How do we adjust and respond to loss? And it can really include a lot of the information around grief and making sense of grief and coming to terms with it and giving us a lot of that information that we may need. But also includes some really interesting reflections and new sort of research about grief as well and in sort of developing our understandings of it. So that can certainly be a nice resource for people as well that sort of want to learn a little bit more about it and look at sort of what's going on in the up-to-date space in grief.
I was just quickly adding that to the list. I'll pop all of those in the show notes. And if people want to connect with you or work with you, what's your availability? What are you offering? How can they get in touch?
Yeah, so people can feel free to send me an email as well, connect on LinkedIn and Instagram and whatnot. I can certainly post all the information as well for you to put in the show notes in regards to that if you would like. And they can sort of check out my website and stuff as well, which I'll provide to you if you like, and can connect, ask any questions or whatnot about the show if they need to, and any need for further information. So certainly happy to help out in that regard.
Lovely. Well, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and a little bits about your personal journey. And I'm hoping listeners will be able to take away something different about this episode than perhaps they might have heard or come across in other kind of formats, because we tend not to talk about it because it's a topic that makes people feel uncomfortable, yet we all kind of go through it.
Yes, yeah. It's funny when you think about it like that. It's just sort of strange thing that we're often struggling with at different points in our life. And often we might go to the supermarket and 50 people in there might be going through the same experience, but we just often don't know and don't talk about it enough. So I think it is quite important, and it's good to have wider education around this area out there. So thanks for having me on the show to chat about all that today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for listening. To keep the conversation going, head on over to Instagram or LinkedIn and follow me. If you'd like to keep updated with episodes and other interesting things happening in mental health, join my weekly This Complex Life newsletter, where I'll share tools, tips and insight. There's a link in the show notes. Got a question you want answered? Shoot me an email or a DM. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy the show, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a rating and a review. It helps other people find the podcast.